have a little tootle down. Bridgewater Arts Centre last week in November. Never miss an opportunity to plug. So yeah, we'll just give it another few seconds. We've got about just over half the people in that we're expecting. So we'll give it till 2 minutes past, and then we'll kick off. So I hope you're all well, and I hope you're all coping. It's been a busy year, hasn't it? And I think now we've sort of got this hybrid situation that we're in, where face-to-face plus these online events, I think life's becoming even more difficult as we try and juggle our responsibilities. But it seems that these Friday lunchtime sessions are very popular, so I hope it's something that's going to stay with us. Look, it's 2 minutes past. We've got a lot to get through, so I'm going to make a start, and then others can always join us as we progress. So, as I say, welcome on behalf of Constructing Excellence Southwest, the Midlands, and the STA, of which I'm Chief Executive, but also the rest of the CE family across the UK, and also CIOB Southwest, who all join us in hosting these regular Fridays, as of course do our hosts, Leaders Meets. Initially, we tried to cover topics that were not Grenfell, that's today, that were COVID related. But obviously, as time's gone on, we've expanded that, and we now cover all the big topics that we're dealing with on a day-to-day basis in the UK construction sector. And today, as you can see on the screen, really, really important and topical subject: improving fire safety in a post-Grenfell era. And I'm delighted that the team from our winning entry for building project of the year, sorry, not building project of the year, winner of winners, I should say, in the Construction Excellence Southwest Awards, have joined us today. And one of the things that impressed the judges most was this very subject. So we thought it was appropriate to invite them along today to speak. So before we do that, we've got a bit of a poll, and we're going to put that slide up now if you'd have a look at. As always, on a Friday now, we ask you to use Slido to answer this poll, and also to ask questions later on. Slido.com is where you need to go on your iPhone, smartphone. Hashtag LM051121, which won't surprise you, stands for Leaders Meets in today's date. So hashtag LM051121. If you care to go there now, please. And is that question 2 we've got up there first, or is there a question before that? I thought that was question 2. Maybe I've got it wrong. Yes, this is question 1. So would you just, first of all, answer in terms of what type of organization you are within the sector, your client, professional advisor, tier 1 contractor, supply chain? Where do you sit? Where do you sit in the industry? Our speakers are keen to find out. So that's question 1. We've got 14 answers so far. That doesn't represent much of about 20% of our audience so far. So keep going. And then question 2 will follow. And again, it's very simple. We could have question 2, Abraham. Are you aware of this project? It's a Plymouth Community Homes project, which is, as I say, an award winner from the CESW awards of last month, or 2 months ago now, I should say. Now, also on Slido.com at the end of the session, we're going to be asking you for feedback. So stay in there. We're going to be having another poll, and we'll have the results of these. But also that's where you're going to need to ask your questions later on. Now, AJ, are you sort of acting as mine host on this? Should I be handing over to you? Because I'm very grateful. It was AJ that I spoke to at the awards back in September. And I asked if he would kindly get a team together from that award-winning project to talk to us about their findings, and he kindly agreed. So I think without further ado, probably AJ, best if I hand over to you and the team, and we'll be back with questions at the end.
Thanks, Andrew. And the first bit of learning for everybody is when Andrew approaches you at 11 o'clock at night and you've had a couple of glasses of red wine, you'll probably agree to everything. So hence we're all here today, and I managed to rope Mike in to that as well, and John as well, I believe. So I think first of all, we're just to give people a little bit of an understanding of the project, we're going to run a little video. So there we go, and John right on cue has arrived. We're going to run the video first to give you a little flavour of the project, give you a bit of a feel for it before we start the presentation. So we could take the video away, please. Great stuff. So hopefully that gives you a bit of a flavour for the project we're talking about today. And I'm delighted to now be able to hand over to John Clark, who's the Chief Executive of Plymouth Community Homes. And a combination with Mike is going to put the presentation up, and John's going to give us a flavour of the project and look at the project from a landlord's perspective. Over to you, John.
Good, thanks, AJ. Can everyone hear me? Yeah, excellent.
Yeah, we're all good, John. All good.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm over in Norway, so I assume that Wi-Fi and everything works the same around the world, but it's my first time not doing it from my office, so I just wanted to check. Hopefully what you've seen from the video is the kind of scale and complexity of the project that we've been dealing with for the last 4 years. And I just want to talk a little bit about how it came into its inception and the kind of journey we've been on with our residents, really. So for PCH and many other tower block owners, day one of the project, I guess, began within a day of the Grenfell fire. The speculation, concern, media interest began immediately. We were constantly talking to residents, inspecting the building, doing interviews with newspapers, TV and radio, had local councillors, the fire brigade, immediately talking to us, chasing us up on what we were doing. So we quickly mobilised our relationship with Bailey Partnership and MySpace, probably within 2 or 3 days of finding out about Grenfell, and we immediately took a couple of the panels off to have a look at them and test them, and immediately had a sense we had a problem, but like everyone else had to send them away to get them checked out. We did a lot of work with the fire service and the council just to understand the building, because actually we'd taken it off them, they'd built it and we'd taken it over around about 10 years ago. and therefore we didn't have all of the detail of the construction. So hopefully we were able to find that, and Bailey Partnerships had some contacts to help us look through that information. So I guess if I think about what happened from then, what really put us off on a positive step was that we'd already had fire doors fitted throughout the whole of the tower blocks. We'd got a lot of experience of managing isolated fires within the towers, and a good resident group to work with who'd done a lot with us over 3 or 4 years previously when we were thinking about introducing sprinklers. So for me, the kind of central to the success of the project was visible leadership, transparency, but probably most importantly, the trust we were able to build up. Trust between us as partners, trust with the residents, and trust with the other agencies we had to work with. Probably the most important thing in gaining that trust was that we did explain to the residents why we weren't removing the cladding immediately. And that was because we knew that the building wasn't wind and watertight. It had been clad in the first place for a reason. So we needed a solution before we started those works. That was quite a challenge with government because all the political messages would get this off now. So we probably pushed back for around about 18 months until we had the right solution. What we did do in the meantime, though, was we implemented the 24/7 working watch. We implemented daily and weekly fire checks. We introduced additional fire safety measures in stairwells, and we began the work around sprinklers, sensors and fire alarms so that residents could see that there was activity happening. Alongside that, I guess one thing that was one of the most challenging to one throughout was that we said that we would progress all the works, all the 3 towers at the same time, and that we'd communicate regularly to residents about how that was going. And actually then trying to find the scaffolders, trying to find the workforce to be able to do that was quite difficult, but it was a commitment that we'd made. We then consulted very early on about the retrofitting of sprinklers in reality. The first thing we found out was that from what we were told, once we got in and did surveys to do that, it was going to be around about 3 or 4 times the cost of what we'd been originally quoted. Once you got inside the building and looked at the construction and looked at how you would be able to lay the flats out, how you could make it something that people could live with so it wasn't spoiling the kind of the livability of the flat, became quite complex. So that meant that from that point onwards, really, we were meeting regularly with residents weekly. I would go to meetings weekly. We'd always have monthly updates of what was happening more broadly around the funding, around what was happening with the press, what the council and the fire brigade were saying. So the other thing, I guess, that really helped residents stay on board, that we did implement some very specific measures to support them. We're conscious that people living in social housing and costs are an important impact on them. So we issued everyone with daylight bulbs. We looked at the scaffolding netting and made sure that we were able to source a netting that allowed lighting and residents to see out, and that helped some families where there was children who were autistic, who needed to have things that happened in the daily life to be able to go to work. So there's some quite complex family situations we had to understand. We also committed to cover any additional costs, energy costs, and we've done that throughout. Just paid a further £150 to everyone not too long ago. But on a practical basis, we also recognise that living with noise and dust and disruption isn't great. So we modernised the community room to give them a space to escape to and put a new TV in and games, and there was lots of residents groups happening in that room. We had days out barbecues, advice sessions in the local cafe with free breakfasts. We met with fire service, police and local councillors in surgery sessions. So that meant that if someone had an issue or a concern, they knew where to go to find something out about it. So that all sounds great, and actually throughout it was, but it's certainly not been plain sailing, and we've had lots of anger, lots of tears and frustration from residents, from partners and sometimes from staff as well. But we've dealt with them head on. We've done what we can to sort things out. We've explained when we can't. And it's fair to say the residents have been amazing. They've stuck with us throughout. And even when the reporters were trying to chase them down for negative stories, they remain positive and were committed to the fact that we were working with them and doing what we could. So some of the other information probably worth me sharing before questions is just to get an understanding that we had to do a lot of campaigning when this first happened to secure funding for the works. The initial response from government was it's over the building owners. And as a social housing organisation, we didn't feel it was right that we'd have to pass the cost on to the poorest in society for the failings of the planning system and the construction sector ultimately. And we did some work with Inside Housing, the trade magazine, and we were recognised as one of the voices that got the government to kind of recognise that something more needed to be done, and we were able to secure the funding. Throughout the project, we've had to deal with sensational media headlines. Reporters never help. Terror towers, I remember seeing a couple of times, and we had reporters turning up outside of times when they said they were going to try and catch people. They thought we were lining people up who said good things, so they try and catch people who'd say something else. Whenever they tried to do that, they didn't find anyone, and then would come back saying we'd set things up again. So it was quite odd. But throughout it all, it was the trust that we had as partners in Bailey's, in MySpace, in Gem Scaffolding, in the fact that anyone who was on site would have the same storyline, that we were there to do the right thing for residents, to keep them safe, and there was no surprises. The three towers are iconic landmarks in the city, and they dominate the skyline as you come across on the ferry from Cornwall. But actually, the most important thing is that they're home to 270 families. So when we look at the cost of this, it's going to be around about 15.5 million. We'll have put £1.5 million into that directly around the sprinklers and some of the making the landscape around the buildings better. And we've secured around about 14 million from government. But actually, the real value is that we don't lose 270 properties at social rent in a city where we need that. We don't disrupt people's lives. So it's not about the cash value, it's actually about the value we place on lives and communities. And very much our feeling is that this changes the way we think about value for community in construction and in housing. And post Grenfell, I hope that what we've all learned is that we have to talk to residents, we have to take on board their concerns, and we have to change things to help them live and continue to live in their home. And it's about how we think differently about how we respond to that, rather than continue to do what we've always done. So that's it for me in this first session. Happy to take questions before we move on.
So if we've got any questions, can we just pop them in the chat for John now?
Sorry, AJ, I didn't know whether you wanted me to pick that up or whether you were doing, I was told you were running the whole shebang during the presentation today.
Well, I can do that, Andrew, and like most things, I'll try and delegate it to somebody. But
okay, yeah, I mean, generally speaking, AJ, just what we try to do is get the questions on Slido.
Yeah,
particularly as we're expecting more than 100 today. So
it's just whether there's anything specific that anybody wanted to ask before we moved on to the next section. Anything?
Okay, yeah, no, fine, yeah.
So don't seem to have anything. So
I'll go back on mute.
Okay, so Mike, can we hand over to you? Probably, as you see from the website, Mike is has got the best photo I've ever seen from any presentation. So Mike, over to you.
Thank you, AJ. Nice introduction. I thought it was useful to just give a lot of people a bit of background history to these projects, because many of us in the city will know them as what they are, but it's useful to just give you a bit of background. So there's three towers, Liner, Tavy and Tamar, and they were originally built around the mid-60s as part of the post-war city reconstruction. And in the late 90s, all three of the towers were overclad. And they were overclad, unfortunately, in ACM, and actually exactly the same product as was used on the Grenfell towers. Why was it done? It was done, obviously, to address thermal insulation and weathering problems with the original 1960s buildings. And it was done to give them a facelift. They were quite tired at that point. They'd had some life, and they were in desperate need of some refresh. They are and were significant buildings, and they were very significant landmarks within our city. And you would see them from everywhere, whether you were coming across on the boat, as John's mentioned, or whether you were walking down the streets. They are very recognisable symbols and landmarks within our city. And then you wake up after such a significant event as Grenfell, and you start to ask significant questions about which buildings in the city do have dangerous cladding materials on them. And obviously it wasn't long before we realised that the towers actually had a very dangerous product on them. The media frenzy was extreme. Every story was in the press. Every time we visited site, we were being photographed. Every activity we were doing was being scrutinised, and so it was very intense media pressure. We'd already been involved, and we were actively involved with the client, looking at the sprinkler system. And again, I think it's very important to recognise that there are 270 properties in these 3 towers and lots of people. So what did we do? Well, the first and most important thing to do was to try and understand what these buildings were, what they were made of and how they were built. And I think it's a common theme that we're finding that we don't always have all of the information that we'd hope to find when we start on any project. So very quickly, we got involved, we got on, and we started to rip this building apart to find out what was happening, taking off some of the cladding panels to try and understand what was behind it, what was between the 1960s building and between the 2000 overclad, because that was the bit we didn't really know much about. So we did this, and we also got some very brave individuals to climb up on the roof and have a look at the state of the roof. Climbing out on the roof of these things, I wouldn't do it personally, but they did a wonderful job of looking at the condition of the roof and other parts of deterioration that were happening to the building that may not have been as present as we saw. We also started to open up parts of the building and find wonderful detailing of buildings and overcladding. This detail sort of illustrates where the new windows had been introduced in the late 90s. But the windows were smaller than the original opening that was formed back in the 1960s building. And there was a wonderful timber infill gap, which was just a wonderful cold bridge and a wonderful sort of just a couple of bits of timber and a bit of plasterboard. You'd never have known it until we actually opened up to find out what was there. Because the project was quite high profile, we did find that a lot of people in the city started to want to get involved and actively do what they could. And we had a wonderful moment where someone walked into our office and gave us this white envelope, in which inside the white envelope was a bundle of wonderful historical photos, photos that we didn't have before. And this was one of them. And it's always good to make sure we take time to look at photographs. And this photograph just looks like a wonderful picture of the building, but if you look a little bit careful, you'll start to see that although the original towers were assumed to be 3 identical buildings, what we could start to see was there were strange differences in the towers and strange things that we didn't really start to understand. And so you can see in the distance here, this is Liner Tower, and you can just see this sort of concrete toe that runs along the face. And then if you look at Tamar to the left, you'll obviously see that that toe's been completely removed. We also were lucky enough to have some wonderful photos of the building when it was built. And here it is, mast climbers and all sorts of aspects. And then the story evolved, and one day we were lucky enough to be given this box file of all of the original drawings. And this was a wonderful moment. And you'll see from these drawings that you'll see that we also would start to discover that at some point the toes of the fabric of the building had actually failed. And so there'd been a significant remedial project that had been undertaken. And it's highly likely that that was probably one of the causes of why the buildings were overclad. These defects in the original 1960s building had led to significant water penetration. The toes were failing, and all of these elements had probably led to a building that was leaking like a sieve. We found it, one of the biggest challenges was obviously recognising that legislation was changing at this point. We didn't have anything that had fallen out from the building safety at this stage. The government website was changing by the day. New guidance was being released to tenants, to designers, to contractors, and we were having to actively respond to these changes by the moment. So it wasn't long before we actually had come up with sort of quite a clear structure about what we were then going to do, how we were going to achieve the technical solution to overcome all of the problems. We spent a huge amount of time looking at various design considerations, different cladding approaches, procurement methods, changes in legislation. And at some point, we made a really bold decision that we were going to take these roofs off. And the roofs of these buildings were quite symbolic. And we had to ask ourselves many times, why are we doing this? Why are we taking a roof off a flat roof building, which is probably there to address many waterproofing issues? The City Council had actively got involved and recognised that one of the biggest problems with EWI schemes in the city is that typically they're not very well maintained. And the reason why most of these buildings are not maintained is because significant access or good access is provided to undertake the maintenance required. On a 15-storey tower, you can't maintain it from the ground. You have to maintain it in a different approach. So taking the roof off gave us the ability to put BMUs onto the roof, which gave us the ability to give the client the option to continually maintain and look after the buildings. John mentioned nicely about the importance of engaging with the tenants. And actually, we involved the tenants throughout the process. These slides here show you a consultation that we undertook with the tenants, where we gave them an opportunity to actually tell us feedback about the designs that we put to them. I love this one here with the where we'd actually taken the roofs off, and you can see that someone had coloured them back on. It was nice to see that they were actually looking at the solutions that we'd put forward. So here's a picture of the original towers. This was one taken probably when we first picked up the scheme and started looking at it. Some early conceptual schemes where we started to look at how we could take the pitched roofs off and look at panel solutions. And this was the actual image that we put in for the actual planning application. And lastly, this is a photo that we took quite recently. And hopefully you can see that the work that's been done on site is a true reflection of real great collaboration, a brilliant team, because the final solution is exactly what we hoped it was going to be. I'm hoping to provide a nice link to AJ here, but one of the first big challenges that we recognised on this project was 3 big towers, a huge amount of scaffolding. And obviously the changing legislation, one of the big ones was that we had to make sure that all of the scaffolding was metal. There is not that much metal scaffolding around in the country, so trying to get this much scaffolding on site was a big challenge. And the evolution of triple stitch netting, a term I'd never come across before until this project. And it was really important to understand that we were about to undertake a major project. We were about to take off the weathering of our building. But what we wanted to make sure we did was not remove the light, not remove natural ventilation to their properties. So a very collaborative approach that took on board that ensured that we could come up with a solution that weatherproofed, but also gave the tenants the ability to still retain their views and still retain natural ventilation. On to Q&A, but I think we're going to slide straight on to you, AJ.
Sounds great. We've got a question in the chat box about resources, but we'll pick that up at the end. Okay, Mike, if you wouldn't mind driving for me. So I guess after all of that great stuff that PCH did and Bailey's did, you would have thought that it would be pretty much plain sailing for us as the contractor by the time we got round to for delivering this project. And you'll be surprised to hear that it wasn't quite as plain sailing as you would have thought. And as Mike said, you know, the early consideration, this is a great photo because it just shows you just how exposed the blocks are. Yeah, they are iconic, and you can see them, you know, when you enter Plymouth from the sea, whether that's on the ferry from Cornwall or if you're coming in from outside in coming through Plymouth Sound. They are iconic blocks that define the skyline of Plymouth as you enter from the sea. That also comes with its own challenges, and that certainly is that they're extremely exposed. The wind speeds that we've recorded on the scaffolds have been phenomenal. Certainly on the roof, and it's strange that you have sometimes it's blowing a gale at the top and it's calm on the bottom, and vice versa as well. So it created some fairly challenging conditions, and as Mike said, the consideration about how we were going to weatherproof the blocks was took a lot of time to come up with, and we did some demos and tried them and looked at shrink wrapping and normal debris netting, and we looked at monoflex and all sorts of things to try and understand how we were going to come up with the right solution. As you said, at the heart of all of that was really the residents. And I think the one thing, the golden thread that runs through this project is just how important every decision you make, whatever the technical solution be, whether it's the design of the blocks, whether it's how you're going to weatherproof them, or what they're going to look like, or how you're going to go about the work sequences, all of it always had a focus around residents, the people who lived in their homes throughout this. And I think that's a really important part of no matter who was involved, whether it was supply chain, whether it was the designers, everything was always reverted back to how's it going to impact the resident, how are we going to deal with that, what are the considerations. So really exposed location. Again, for delivering a project, that again came with its own challenges. If we're talking about taking roofs off, lifting things with cranes, it made it really difficult in terms of picking the right time to do things. And there was a lot of time that was spent before we really got to site and started to tackle the outside of the building with Mike and his team and the client around just when we were going to program things to happen. Because we knew that if we were trying to do certain activities, the sort of inherent weather conditions could really hamper our ability to do the project. So for us on the contracting side, there's real focus around using local people, looking at local supply chains, looking at local manufacturers, and seeing how we could keep as much of that money that was being invested in the blocks in the city. So we used the local window manufacturer with Plymouth Community Homes window manufacturers. We used a manufacturer for the sills and the window surrounds. And again, wherever we could, there was a local option. It was really explored. Again, used lots of small local SMEs to try and make sure that we had local people doing the work. But for us, there was two real stages to this project. That we did as John rightfully said, the early stage of the project was to get the sprinklers installed. And I think that was the real start of a really collaborative approach to the overall project. It was really important that that we were sort of, we knew the eyes of Plymouth were on us, and the sector as well. It was one of the very early post Grenfell refurbishment projects, so we knew that we needed to get it right. So the sprinkler phase was a really interesting program. Three blocks, fitting pipe work through blocks, getting into people's homes, and we'll have a look a little bit later about just how that how we developed the design as we went along. But again, I think very early on, it sort of cemented that collaborative approach of working together to come up with a solution that was going to work for residents, for us as a delivery partner, but something that was going to look right for people's homes. So I've got a couple of little examples here of just the complexity of, from a construction perspective, just how you go about doing a project like this and some of the considerations. So as Mike rightfully said, the decision was made fairly boldly that we were going to take the roof off. And I do remember the early discussions where we sat down and go, right, we're just going to take the roof off. And it was very much just like that. Yeah, we'll just take it off, shall we? It was when we started to look at what was actually involved with doing that, it became far more complex than I think any of us ever really envisaged it was going to be. So part of that was that we'll have a little bit look later, is that when the overclad was done in the sort of late 90s, there was a lot more space around blocks, around the towers. So getting a crane in was much easier. And the steels in some of these sections are considerable, like between 3 and 5 tons. Some of the structural members in here. So we started to look about how we're actually going to take it apart, and what we found was, through Mike's team and through Erie and Coles, who were structural engineers, that actually this structure was almost like a self-supporting. So you couldn't take one bit out with the rest of it falling down. That was then made more challenging by the roof that we thought was a solid concrete slab turned out to be a clay pot construction. So in certain cases, there was very little concrete, certainly not enough to hold a piece of steel. If it dropped, it would have gone straight through into the flat below. So we had to think about how we were going to do that. So the picture on the right with all the scaffolding that is with someone there with an orange high vis on is the crash deck that sits below the roof structure, that was needed to be really specially designed so it didn't bear on the roof structure and was available to support the roof above. So I think if we looked at the video earlier, you would have seen some people cutting the steels, and that's exactly how we went apart. We took it apart bit by bit, with it being supported from the crash deck below. And really what that ensured was that there was no potential for that steel to drop and fall through the roof or through the flat roof. So again, that took a lot of organising, a lot of arranging. And as Mike said at the start, there was a reason that a pitch roof was put on these blocks, and that was because the previous flat roof leaked like a sieve. So before we could even put the crash deck in or start taking the old roof off, we needed to put a temporary waterproofing solution on the old roof to make sure that when we took the pitched roof off, that the water didn't pour through the blocks or pour through into the flats below. So it's a strange scenario where you're putting something down knowing that you're going to have to take it up again to put the permanent solution down. But we needed something that could be sacrificial. It didn't matter if it got damaged or scratched. The permanent solution was an insulated roof solution, but would never have taken the weight of any of the steel hitting it or any of the scaffolding that was going to get trafficked above it. So again, all of this work took a long time to consider. The next part of that consideration was then thinking about how we were going to put the steel, the BMU on the roof, because when we realised that the clay pot roof was not to the construction we thought it was, that then posed another question about how we were going to put I think 5-ton BMU unit and track on the roof and allow it to move around. So again, Erin Coles and Bailey's and my space and the team worked really closely together to think about how we were going to come up with a solution that was going to work, and then the practicalities of how we were going to actually put that steel up on the roof. Again, as we said earlier, some of the early construction or the early work that had been done when the overcladding was done was allowed for a much bigger crane to be used, and we ended up having to use probably one of the only cranes in the country that was small enough but with a high enough boom to be able to lift the weight of steel that we needed up onto the top of the tower blocks. And that's because in the sort of last 20 years, the buildings around the towers had been knocked down and redeveloped. So the access around them was much more limited than previously had been enjoyed, as well as, we had to close the roads off to do the work. We needed to make sure we picked the right weather conditions, because if it was too windy, we couldn't lift. And we need to think really carefully about the lifting plan of how we were going to create a safe environment to do that. Especially we had people in their homes as well. So really interesting considerations, and a project that you wouldn't do, you do probably once in a lifetime. So a real challenge, but I think the collaboration there was really, really important by all parties. And again, thinking about how we were going to do that, how we kept residents informed was critical. So I was just going to touch on the sprinklers for a little bit, because we've had a lot of interest from people about the sprinkler systems, and lots of people are thinking about putting these in. So the picture on the left-hand side is technically the solution that was going to be deployed originally. It absolutely does everything you need it to do. It is a sprinkler system that delivers the safety requirements that a landlord needs to deliver. But you just need to look at that and say, you wouldn't have it in your home. So, and the picture on the right is what we finally put in. So much more aesthetically pleasing, and whilst you might look at that and think that's just a box, I can tell you that a lot of hard work came into coming up with that solution that would, and a lot of consultation with residents to find something that worked for them. The other consideration from a health and safety perspective with the solution on the left-hand side was that when we started to talk to the specialist who was going to install the pipe work, it turned out that the adhesive that was used to stick the pipe work together was actually incredibly toxic, and the resident couldn't be in the property whilst it was being done, and for some period afterwards as well. So from a practicality point of view, we had a real problem with that as well. So if we just flick on to the next one, Mike, what you'll see is what we started to develop. We did a load of different mock-ups and different ideas for residents so that they could have a look and think about what they wanted putting in, what it looked like in their homes. They had a vote on some of the thoughts. And again, that we also started to think about how we were going to limit the time in the property. How could we get in and out in a short period of time with a sort of self-finished solution? So if you just flick on to the next one, you'll find that we ended up, there we go. So this is some work in progress. You'll see that we ended up changing to a galvanized pipe solution. And that's the first phase of the install. And then we had the self-finished boxes that enclosed the finalized the sprinkler heads. So it's a concealed system, just looks like a bit of a box with a white cap over the front of it. So it doesn't look like a fire safety solution, but it's a really effective method of installing a sprinkler system. As John said, it ended up costing a lot more money than Plymouth Community Homes had ever envisaged in spending. But actually it's the most practical solution that was able to be fitted. And we were in and out in about a day. And out of all the blocks that we did, out of all of the properties we did, out of the 270 homes, we managed to gain access to every single property without any legal enforcement requirement, which is astounding given the amount of work that needed to be done. And it just plays testament to the work that Plymouth Community Homes team did in terms of that resident engagement and that relationship building they did with them, the relationships they formed with the care sector. Were looking after some of the most vulnerable people in the towers, and it really paved the way for the project that we ended up then delivering on the outside of the buildings, through what was probably the most challenging period of our working life, or even our personal life, through the COVID pandemic. Again, we got to that phase, that relationship and that trust that had been built really helped, when we paused the project to decide what we were going to do as a team going forward, how we were actually going to finish the project off while we're still working on people's homes. We're taking windows out and working around them, and when people were really concerned, that relationship that had been built and the trust had been built really helped pave the way to be able to get the project completed in the end. So I think we've got that brings us to a close. And as it says here, it's a lasting legacy to the Plymouth skyline. And you know, a lot of the people that we've worked on the project from my space, the majority of people from Plymouth, and they look at these towers every day, and it's been a personal memento for them to be able to look up at a project and say, you know, I did that, and they're really, really proud of what they've achieved, along with everybody who's been involved with the project. So with that in mind, we've got about 15 minutes left to go.
So AJ, John and Mike, thank you so much. A really interesting session and highly topical, which is probably why we've got so many people on the call today. So we've got some questions on Slido. If we could add those up, Abraham, we'll take them. We're going to do the feedback first, are we? Okay, let's do the feedback first. So question 1, let's have a look, see what our audience look like. Here we go. The answers would be good. Right, there we go. So half our audience professional advisors, and they're pretty much an even split between the rest. I don't suppose that's a surprise, AJ, is it? You would expect professional advisors to be really interested in what you have to say.
Yeah,
so,
I think there's a lot of there's a lot of work being done in the sector. I think there's a lot of interest in learning the lessons, and I think all of us would say that, you know, if anybody's got any questions posted or wants to contact us individually, then we're more than happy to share
the knowledge
experiences. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And the next one, in terms of the project, so 1/3 knew about it and 2/3 didn't. So there we go. Let's go into the questions if we can, because the questions are beginning to come in, and I think it's important that we cover as many as we can. So, is there 24/7 inspection on the cladding before they're installed with new regulations? Who's going to pick that one up?
Just for clarity, as the new EWI that has been installed is inspected. Every part of the installation is inspected by a MySpace site manager. We go through a rigorous QA process to sign those off, and it's also inspected by the system manufacturer, who signs off a warranty. So they come and do a regular inspection. That's from our SECO to ensure that the system's been installed as per their specification. So we've got a number of checks and balances, and then Bailey Partnership also sign off at key stages as well as the project progresses. Well, progressed, I should say.
Thank you, AJ. May we have the next question, Abraham, please? So apologies if I missed the section of the presentation, but what was the procurement process adopted? How did you go about managing quality of build process? Procurement always comes in pretty early on these questions. So who wants to pick that one up? John, is that one for you?
Probably not. I mean, what I would say is that from a procurement perspective, the challenge for us was actually that we needed to do something instantly, and we had pressure from government to do that. So that's why we went to Bailey Partnership and MySpace. The challenge that we had as we start to move forward with that is that the government said that anything that hadn't been fully procured through a longer process wouldn't be eligible for any of the funding. So we did miss out on the first chunk of funding around that. I don't know a lot about the procurement process beyond that, but probably Bailey's would be able to talk about the engagement of MySpace and how that happened.
Mike, do you want to pick that up?
Yeah, I mean, I think John summed it up quite nicely there. I mean, I think, again, the key here was that because of the pressures from trying to deliver the project as early as possible, we had to work with known partners, known teams that we knew had the experience and the capabilities to deliver this project. Obviously, having knowledge of this building already was a huge importance for us. So that made clear decisions in terms of how we could do it and how we could procure the works and successfully deliver it. Recognizing that one of the most significant things was trying to get this cladding off this building as quickly as possible.
Okay.
In essence, it was effectively a two-stage process. There was a selection process initially, and part of whilst the scope of the project was known in its essence, there wasn't the detail in terms of pricing it was not clear. So we had a starting position. There was an experience, a selection criteria. I think there was four potential partners that put bids in, which was very clearly at that stage around the cost around some known elements, things like prelims and overhead and profit. And then as the design was developed and those packages were finalised, what we did is we worked with Bailey's, and once we got the specification and those elements together, we went out to the supply chain and we priced those elements with the supply chain all in an open and transparent way, so that we would then put all of that information together into package reports, which would then go through Bailey's for validation, and then went to PCH in order to sign off on each element of the project. So as we worked through the project, as we closed out the risks and closed out the design, we were able to finalise those elements of work.
Okay, thank you. Let's move on, because we've got questions coming in. I'd like to try and get through all of them if we can. So after the investigation from Grenfell, was anyone punched for their negligence? Does that mean punched? That's an interesting one. Who wants to answer that?
I mean, I'll say something initially, because I mean, I think one of the challenges, if we're honest, in the sector is that Grenfell wasn't just about the cladding. It was about a number of other indicators, and people keep talking about the cladding. So we had the same cladding on our building. We'd had over 30 fires over the period that we were looking after the building. And because the fire stopping was done well, and because we maintained the building well, and we put fire doors on at the earliest opportunity, none of those fires spread into anything else. And actually the challenge that we had was that when we were doing works and we couldn't get residents to come out when there was any false fire alarms, they were so used to things being managed so effectively that they wouldn't leave, and we'd move to a leave the building while we were putting the new alarm systems in and making sure that everyone was safe. So I think it has been quite interesting, the fallout from Grenfell, and hopefully the inquiry actually comes out with the real issues that we have to address, and some of them are being picked up in the Hackett review. But certainly sorting cladding out is one of the obvious things, because of how Grenfell looked when it went up. But actually the reasons for it are in the fabric and construction of the building, not just the cladding.
Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing from a constructing excellence point of view, obviously the cladding is the major detail, specific detail to this project. But I think from a CE point of view, what interests me, particularly reading the Dame Judith Hackett report, that she actually points out the same issues with our industry that Sir John Egan pointed out in 1998, that we haven't got an integrated industry and we haven't got a collaborative culture. And we've got this passing of risk and this race to the bottom. So all the failures that were around in the 90s haven't actually been answered properly. So from a CE point of view, I think it gives us extra incentive to push forward on our agenda. I've got some more questions. We've only got a few minutes, so we have to whip through these. How did you log the works? BIM, photo scanning? AJ, you probably want to pick that one up.
Yeah, so we didn't use BIM on this particular project, but yeah, every single element is photographed. So, for example, we did a penetration log. So any penetration for a fire compartment was individually registered on the drawing. It had its own registration, it had a certification number, it had a drawing, a photo that went with it. So yeah, there's all electronically recorded for the next phase of the building and what the builders can use it for.
Thanks, AJ. Next question, please, Abraham. What key suggestions would you give to other similar projects in the making? Who wants to pick that one up?
So shall I start from a contractor's perspective? Or I think a general perspective. I think it's a great point that you made, Andrew, about collaboration. And it is, I know that it's a lifelong piece of work for you. But projects of this nature, you have to have partners that can work together. This has been an immensely challenging project. You know, you would never have commenced a project in the way that it was started like this. You know, we did 3 towers, we did them all at the same time. You know, politically, we had to do it that way, but you would never undertake a project in that nature, because when you come across an issue on one block, it affects all of them at the same time. And but we had to do it that way. If you were doing it differently, would you do it that way? Of course you wouldn't. No, because, and as Mike said, that meant masses and masses of scaffold. Masses of steel scaffold boards. They just didn't exist. They had to be manufactured for the project, because there wasn't enough of them about.
I think a CE case study probably is called for, AJ, to be honest, with lessons learned.
It's in the writing at the moment. Yeah, it's being done.
Excellent.
Yeah, so from my point of view, I think that part of working collaboratively, and that's not all about agreeing with each other all the time. What that's about is being able to challenge each other and work together, and come across, not getting the contract out and going, well, actually, nothing to do with us. You tell us what you want to do. It is very much about solutions, understanding technical solutions, and thinking about how that impacts people in their homes, because that was critical. And without the residents' engagement, we would never have delivered the project.
Abraham, may we have the next question, please? Was there improvement in thermal performance of the building on completion? Is that one for you, Mike?
Yeah, I'm happy to pick that up. We actually did improve the thermal performance of the insulation of the building. We did a lot of checks on the U value requirements, and we obviously had to do a lot of checks to make sure that we weren't going to cause undue risks to consider condensation and so forth inside the property. So it was one of the primary drivers. Okay, thank you. Is there anything you do differently in hindsight? I think we covered that in the previous question. So let's move on to the next one, please. With their new idea of carbon emissions of the built environment, how much effect has cladded to the operational carbon emissions? Is that one for you, Michael, again? I mean, again, I think the improvement in thermal properties on this was a big driver. This building has got some other challenges inside of it, which would definitely look at addressing. It's got a very dated heating system and a very unique something. We didn't even touch on it really, which is called a sea duct, which is a very unique thing to buildings of this time. You can probably see it in the whole photos, just prodding its head above the top of the roof, but extremely difficult to deal with, probably a very inefficient heating system of its date, of its time, and probably, I think, if you're looking to improve the efficiencies of this building, definitely look to replace those. Okay, thanks, Mike. The last question is also a repeat of one we've done before, Abraham. So if we could move beyond the next question, because we only got about a minute left. Can we move on to the slide where we talk about the exit survey, please, Abraham, if we can? Thank you. Hello, Abraham. Are you with me? Well, look, while I'm waiting for that to come up, can I thank you, gentlemen, for a really, really interesting 60 minutes. I don't know whether you've been watching the chat, but a lot of very positive comments in the chat. In fact, some saying it's the best one we've ever done. The best use of time. So really exciting stuff. Also people talking about recordings, and that will be available. We record all of these, and they are available at the leadersmeets.com website. If you want a certificate, CPD certificate for what you've heard and learnt today, there's the details on the screen, mypropass.co.uk, and the code for today, CE-866. We are, of course, back again next week. And we're talking next week, aligned sort of topic, if you like, but the future of construction, health, safety, and quality. So we're extending the agenda of what we've been talking about today, but in similar terms, if you like. So that's next week at 12 o'clock. And what have you got for me next, Abraham? Oh, yes. We've got 2 face-to-face summits coming up, one in the Southwest in Exeter on the 17th of November. And in fact, AJ is going to be back to present at that for me, along with other topics. I'll be coming fresh from COP26, where I am
next week with the latest on the net zero agenda. And then the following day, I believe, Abraham, we are in Birmingham for a similar event for the Midlands Summit. So a couple of live face-to-face events coming up for you there, ladies and gents, if you can make it. And have we got the slide now, Abraham, about the exit survey? Somewhere? No? Yes, we have. There we go. So we're going to keep this open for about 15 minutes, folks. Back to slido.com, hashtag LM051121. If you would feed out the survey, it's very helpful. Hopefully you'll feed out with the comments that you've put in the chat box. That would be really good. It gives us a good feel for the type of event you'd like us to provide on a Friday lunchtime while you're having your sandwiches. So finally then, ladies and gentlemen, I've just creaked over by a minute. I do apologize, but that's probably because of the importance of the topic today. So thank you, gentlemen, for your time. Really much appreciated by all of us present. Thank you to Howard and Abraham for hosting us on Leaders Meets. Time for me now to say goodbye. Have a great weekend. I'm off to Southampton to watch the Saints beat Aston Villa. See you next week. Bye-bye now.
Bye.
Bye, everyone. Have a great weekend.